It seemed like an ordinary service call, just a simple fix, nothing remarkable. At first, I barely gave it a second thought. I was 60 years old, living alone in a quiet, predictable life, untouched by the excitement of longing for longer than I'd care to admit. But that Wednesday afternoon, when Jacob walked into my home, young, strong, and radiating a hesitant charm, something inside me shifted. What began as a harmless encounter soon morphed into something much riskier. Our previously professional exchanges turned tense, and as I found myself stepping over lines I hadn't realized existed, the boundary between craving and fixation became murky. I hadn't intended this, hadn't seen it coming, but whatever had awakened inside me refused to be ignored. I'd been staring at that leaking faucet for days, watching the water pool in the sink, a constant reminder of how little I noticed my surroundings. After years of meticulously planned home improvements, everything now felt empty, without someone to share it with. The house had grown too large since my divorce, each room carrying echoes of memories I tried not to revisit. The kitchen, once the lively heart of our family life, had slipped into a quiet state of disrepair, not unlike myself. So when the leak became impossible to ignore, I did something I hadn't done in ages. I reached out for help. I found a local handyman, Jacob. The name meant nothing to me, just someone to handle the job. I expected a gruff, older man, maybe with rough edges and years of experience. But when I opened the door on that chilly Wednesday, I was greeted instead by a young man in his 20s. Jacob stood before me, towering over me slightly, carrying a toolbox in one hand. He wore a plain gray shirt stretched snugly across his broad chest. His nervous smile never quite touched his eyes, yet something about him captivated me instantly. "Hi, I'm here to check out the sink," he said, his voice deep yet soft. I blinked, momentarily startled by the way my heart gave a faint, unexpected flutter. It was a ridiculous reaction, really. Those feelings should have been long behind me by now. Yet there it was, a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. "Come in," I managed to say, stepping aside to let him enter. As Jacob moved through the kitchen, quietly observing the space, I couldn't help but watch him. His movements were precise as he knelt to examine the pipes beneath the sink, his hands working with confident ease. I lingered near the kitchen island, pretending to busy myself with something else, but my focus never truly left him. There was something in the way he moved, the strength in his arms as he tightened the bolts, that held my attention. I hadn't been this close to a younger man in years, and I hadn't even considered what that might feel like until now. It wasn't just Jacob's looks that stirred something inside me, though he was undeniably attractive in a rugged, effortless way. No, it was the energy he seemed to carry with him, a warmth that clashed with the quiet emptiness that had settled over my life. For a moment, I caught myself leaning on the counter, watching him too closely. I adjusted my robe, a robe I'd never before thought of as provocative, and straightened up, trying to brush away the foolish thoughts creeping into my mind. Jacob glanced up from his work, and our eyes met. I caught the flicker of surprise in his gaze as his eyes briefly scanned me before he quickly turned back to the sink. I noticed the faint flush in his cheeks, and I couldn't deny the small thrill I felt from it. It was innocent enough, yet there was no mistaking the stirring inside me, a feeling I hadn't allowed myself to indulge in for a long time. I moved closer, standing near him as he worked. Though his focus remained on the repair, I sensed the nervousness beneath his steady hands, as if he was trying not to acknowledge my presence. "Everything going okay down there?" I asked, my voice softer than I'd intended. "Yeah," he replied without looking up. "Just a minor leak. Shouldn't take much longer." I reached out then, placing a light hand on his shoulder. Just a gentle squeeze. His muscles tensed beneath my fingers, and an unexpected rush of power surged through me. It had been so long since I'd felt that, knowing I could still have that effect on someone. "You're really strong," I said, my tone slipping into something slightly more flirtatious than I'd planned. Jacob looked up, startled, his face flushing deeper. Thanks," he muttered. I smiled at him, a soft, knowing smile. The air between us seemed heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension. I could feel it, and so could he. He shifted uneasily, clearly trying to stay focused on the task at hand, but the slight tremble in his fingers as he tightened the final bolt told me everything I needed to know. I moved even closer, leaning over the counter to watch him. Jacob stood then, wiping his hands on a rag, his gaze carefully avoiding mine. "Need any help?" I asked, though I knew full well he didn't. He shook his head quickly, focusing on packing up his tools, but his hands still shook. Once again, I reached out, this time allowing my fingers to brush along his arm, feeling the warmth of his skin. He froze, and I could see the conflict flashing across his face. Part of him wanted to respond. I knew it. Yet another part of him resisted, knowing it was wrong. I should have known better too, but in that moment I didn't care. I let my hand linger, feeling the electric tension crackling between us. His breath was shallow as he met my gaze, his eyes betraying the struggle he was trying to contain. For a moment his eyes widened, and I wondered if he might step closer, closing the gap between us. But instead, he retreated a step, breaking the moment. "Ma'am," he stammered, his voice unsteady, "I'm just here to fix the sink." I gave him a small smile, amused by how flustered he seemed. "Are you sure there's nothing else that needs attention?" I asked, my voice carrying a playful edge. He seemed unsure whether to stay or leave, his hands trembling slightly as he packed up his tools. I could tell he was fighting to stay composed. I moved nearer, my lips only inches from his. "There is something else you could help me with," I murmured in a low, suggestive tone. He didn't reply, only stared at me, frozen in place. I leaned closer as if I was about to kiss him, but before I could, he quickly stepped back, raising his hands defensively. "I can't," he said firmly, shaking his head. "I really can't." I pouted slightly, disappointed, but I knew he wasn't rejecting me because he wasn't interested. It was clear he was afraid of giving in. He left in a hurry, nearly bolting from the house, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen once more. Yet his abrupt exit didn't feel final. There was something unfinished, something left unresolved. I knew deep down that Jacob's refusal wasn't about a lack of desire. It was because he didn't trust himself not to say yes. In the days that followed, I found myself caught between excitement and frustration. I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob, the way he'd hesitated, how his gaze had lingered on me just a moment too long. It had been so long since I'd felt this way, since I'd felt anything at all. And now, this young man had ignited something in me, something I thought had long since faded. I assumed I wouldn't see him again. I figured Jacob had convinced himself it was best to avoid returning. But then, about a week later, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but when I answered, it was him. Hi, this is Jacob, the plumber. I just wanted to check if everything's still good with the sink. Did the fix hold up? His tone was polite, professional even, but there was a slight tremble in his voice. He was nervous, and that thrilled me more than I cared to admit. "Oh, Jacob," I said, working to keep my voice casual, even though I knew exactly where this was going. "Funny you should ask. The sink's fine, but there's another issue in the bathroom I was hoping you could look at. Probably nothing major, but I'd rather have a professional check it out." There was a pause on the line. I could hear him weighing his options. "I can be there in about an hour," he said at last. When I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. This time, I had no intention of letting him leave so easily. When Jacob arrived, he seemed more nervous than before. He tried to maintain his calm, professional manner, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He avoided my gaze as I guided him upstairs to the bathroom. The faucet problem was minor, a loose handle, but I knew that wasn't the real reason he had returned. As he worked, I lingered nearby, silently watching him. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken that made my skin prickle. This time, Jacob kept his head down, determinedly focused on the repair. Yet I could sense that he was far more aware of me now, more conscious of the narrow space between us. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Jacob," I said softly, stepping closer, "I've been thinking about you." His hand froze for a moment on the faucet, his grip tightening. He didn't look up, but I saw his knuckles turn pale and his breathing quicken slightly. "You have?" His voice was guarded, uncertain if he should acknowledge what had happened before. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about the last time you were here," I continued, my voice low and intimate. "You seemed interested, but you pulled away. Why?" At first, he didn't answer, still focusing on the faucet, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "It's just, I'm a professional," he said quietly, almost whispering. "It wouldn't be right." "Wouldn't it?" I asked, stepping closer still. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Who's to say what's right or wrong, Jacob? We're both adults. We both know there's something between us. You can feel it, can't you?" He looked at me then, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with the same inner battle I'd seen before. He was struggling, I could tell. He was fighting hard to stay professional, to maintain distance. But the tension had already built past the point of no return, and I wasn't about to let it slip away now. I reached out, brushing my fingers lightly across his chest, feeling his heartbeat thudding beneath my hand. His breath hitched, and for a moment I thought he might back away again, but instead his hand shot out, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward him. The touch wasn't rough, but it was firm. His face was suddenly close to mine, his breath warm against my skin. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and intense. "This isn't a game." "I never said it was," I replied, my lips curling into a knowing smile. There was no turning back now. Jacob's hand remained on my arm, tight, yet hesitant, as though he wasn't sure he trusted himself to let go. His expression was raw, unguarded, nothing like the nervous professionalism he'd shown before. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the air between us shift, becoming something deeper, something far more dangerous. I leaned closer, my lips hovering just inches from his. His grip on my arm tightened slightly, like he was torn between drawing me in and pushing me away. For a moment, I wondered if he'd retreat again, if he'd leave and never return. But then his breathing quickened, and I knew he was feeling what I was feeling. "Sometimes you just have to let go," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but filled with quiet promise. Jacob hesitated for only a heartbeat longer, and then, as if something inside him snapped, he pulled me closer and kissed me. It wasn't soft or hesitant like I'd imagined. His lips met mine with an urgency that sent a shiver racing through me, his hands gripping me tightly, as though he couldn't hold back any longer. Here's the completely rewritten text while maintaining its original meaning and length. His hands held onto my waist as though he feared releasing me. I returned his kiss, my arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him in even closer, the warmth between us intensifying with each passing second. The world around us seemed to fade. The bathroom, the sink, the leak, everything disappeared as his touch overwhelmed me. His hands moved lower to my hips, and I could sense the tension in his body, the way he was restraining himself, unsure of going too far, but already deeply involved. We broke apart just briefly to catch our breath, our foreheads resting against each other, our breathing erratic and uneven. I could feel his heart pounding against his chest, the beat racing under my fingers. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a fleeting moment for him. It was something he had been battling with for a long time, something he hadn't been ready to admit, even to himself. "What now?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, his gaze searching mine for answers. I smiled, stepping back just enough to give him room, but not too much, still feeling the magnetic pull between us, the undeniable connection that had led us here. "I think you already know the answer, Jacob," I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. We've crossed the line. Why stop now? For a moment, he didn't respond. He stood there, watching me, the conflict still visible in his eyes. But then, with one final glance at the door, he reached for me again. His hands found their place on my waist, pulling me back to him. This time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. We both knew exactly what we were doing. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Jacob and I barely left the bathroom, the tension between us finally unraveling in a way that felt both inevitable and thrilling. His hands were everywhere, my shoulders, my waist, my hips. His touch firm but respectful, as though he were giving up control but still holding onto some semblance of restraint. But I didn't want restraint. Not now. I hadn't felt this alive in years, not since before the divorce. My life had been so monotonous for so long, eating alone, quiet evenings watching TV, the occasional call from my grown children. I hadn't realized how much I had missed this, how much I needed to feel desired again. Jacob kissed me deeply, his lips trailing down my neck as his hands slid lower to grip my hips. I gasped softly, my head falling back as I surrendered to the moment. There was something intoxicating about being with him, this young, strong man who seemed to see me in a way no one had for so long. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was a connection that went deeper, something neither of us had anticipated but couldn't deny. Eventually, we made our way to the bedroom. The air between us crackled with an energy I hadn't felt in years. As we lay tangled in the sheets, I couldn't help but smile to myself, feeling more alive than I had in what seemed like a lifetime. I've never done anything like this, Jacob murmured, his voice low and husky as he lay beside me, his fingers lazily tracing circles on my arm. Neither have I admitted softly. He turned to face me, his expression filled with something I hadn't expected. Vulnerability. I shouldn't have, he said, shaking his head slightly. But I don't regret it. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat beneath my fingers, and smiled gently. Neither do I. We lay there in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts, the weight of what had just occurred hanging in the air between us. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like we had crossed an unknown boundary, one we hadn't realized existed, but neither of us wanted to undo it. After a while, Jacob sat up, glancing at the clock. I should go, he said, his voice tinged with reluctance, mirroring my own feelings. I've been here longer than I planned. You don't have to go, I said, though I knew he had to. He hesitated, looking at me as if he wanted to stay, but then he shook his head. I don't want this to be awkward, he said, his voice soft but firm. I don't want you to think I was just... I smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. I don't, I said, sitting up beside him. You're a good man, Jacob. We both needed this, and I'm glad it happened. But I'm not expecting anything more than what this was. He looked relieved, though there was still a hint of confusion in his eyes, as though he wasn't used to things being so straightforward. "So, you're really okay with everything? No weird feelings or anything?" I laughed softly, shaking my head. "No, Jacob, no weird feelings. It was just one of those moments. No strings, no pressure." He nodded slowly, as if he were still trying to understand the simplicity of it all. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "I guess I'll see you around." "Maybe," I teased lightly. "If my sink breaks again, you'll be the first one I call." That made him smile. He stood up, grabbed his tools, and slung his bag over his shoulder. But before he left, he turned to me one last time. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft yet sincere, "I don't regret it. I just want you to know that." I smiled, watching him open the door. "Neither do I." And just like that, he was gone. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Jacob more than I should. Every time I passed the sink, I remembered how he had looked at me, how his hands had trembled when I touched his arm, the heat of his kiss, the way his body had pressed against mine. It had been so long since I felt anything like that. I hadn't expected him to call again. I thought he had probably convinced himself it was a one-time thing, that it shouldn't happen again, and maybe he was right. Maybe it shouldn't have happened in the first place, but I didn't regret it, not for a second. Still, I wasn't sure if I'd ever see him again. I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. The logical part of me knew this was dangerous territory. There was an age gap, a power dynamic, societal expectations, and the real possibility that we were playing with fire. But the part of me that had felt so alive in his arms didn't care about any of that. I knew if he called, I wouldn't say no. Then, one afternoon, about a week after he left, my phone rang. The moment I saw his name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been expecting it, hadn't even thought it was a possibility. I had been hoping for it. But there it was. His name, his number, a way back to the excitement we'd shared. "Hey." His voice was uncertain, cautious, as though he wasn't sure if he should even be calling. "I just wanted to check on the faucet, make sure everything's still working well." There was a brief pause, and I could sense the hesitation in his voice, as if he was trying to reassure himself that this was still just a professional call. But we both knew better. "The faucet is fine," I answered, letting my voice soften just enough to make it clear that I wasn't referring to the sink. "But there's another issue you might be able to help me with." Another pause. I could almost hear his heartbeat quicken on the other end of the line, the hesitation telling me that he was weighing his options, deciding whether he should come back. "I'll be there in an hour," Jacob replied, his voice barely audible, like he was unsure of his choice. But deep down I knew that, like me, he couldn't stay away. After hanging up, a rush of anticipation hit me. It had been so long since I felt this kind of excitement, a mix of nervous energy and raw desire surging through me, almost like an electric current. I told myself it was just a temporary indulgence, nothing serious or lasting, but the truth was it already felt like more. For the next hour, I found myself pacing around the house, straightening things that didn't really need attention, trying to calm the excitement building inside me. This wasn't like me. I had never been the kind of person to lose control, to let myself get swept up in something reckless. But with Jacob, all the walls I had carefully built over the years seemed to crumble. When he arrived, I felt that same rush all over again. He stood in the doorway, hesitant but clearly drawn to the magnetic pull between us. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same flicker of uncertainty that had been there last time. But there was something else, something darker, more intense. He stepped inside, and I could feel the electricity between us grow. We didn't say much as I led him to the bathroom, pretending that there was some small issue that needed fixing. But we both knew the real reason he was there. Once we were alone in the bathroom, the atmosphere shifted. Jacob tried to focus on the task at hand, his hands fidgeting with the faucet. But I could see how his fingers trembled slightly. He was nervous, but so was I. Nervous about what we were doing, but more than that, nervous about how much I wanted this. I moved closer, watching him pretend to inspect the faucet, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the task. The silence between us was thick, laden with unspoken desire. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached out, placing my hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through his shirt. Jacob froze at my touch, his body going rigid for a moment. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. But then slowly, he turned to face me, his eyes filled with the same internal conflict I had seen before. "Jacob," I whispered, my voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to pretend anymore." His breath caught, and for a second I thought he might pull away again, that he might leave just like last time. But then something shifted in him. His expression changed, his resolve broke, and without another word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine with a force that took my breath away. It was different this time. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Jacob wasn't holding back anymore. His hands roamed over my body with urgency, sending shivers down my spine. I kissed him back, my fingers tangling in his hair as I pressed myself against him, losing myself in the intensity of the moment. We didn't stop, not this time. The bathroom felt too small, too confined for what was happening between us. Without breaking the kiss, Jacob lifted me up, carrying me to the bedroom, where the boundaries between us disappeared completely. The next hours passed in a blur of sensation and emotion, the world outside fading away as we gave in to the desire we had both been trying so hard to ignore. Jacob's hands moved over me with a kind of reverence, a need that matched my own. And in those moments, nothing else mattered. I felt more alive than I had in years. It was as though the years had melted away, and I was no longer the woman who had spent so much of her life wrapped in routine, in the quiet loneliness of a large, empty house. With Jacob, I felt wanted, desired. There was no shame, no guilt, only the heat between us and the shared understanding that we both needed this. Jacob's touch was both gentle and demanding, a mixture of control and release. He kissed me with a hunger that took me by surprise, his lips exploring mine with such passion that my heart raced. I kissed him back with equal intensity, pulling him closer, unwilling to let the moment slip away. As we lay tangled together afterward, our bodies exhausted, the silence between us was comforting, not awkward. I could feel Jacob's breath on my neck, slow and steady, as his fingers traced random patterns on my skin. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his body next to mine, the weight of his presence. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was no need. We both knew what had just happened wasn't just a fleeting moment of passion. It was something deeper, something neither of us had expected but couldn't deny. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not as a sick 60-year-old woman, not as someone's ex-wife, but as a person, as a woman who still had the capacity to feel, to desire, to live. But reality has a way of creeping in, no matter how hard you try to push it away. As the hours passed, I began to feel the weight of what had happened settle over me. Jacob was young, so much younger than me, and while the age difference hadn't mattered in the heat of the moment, I knew it couldn't be ignored forever. I glanced at Jacob, still lying beside me, his eyes closed. His breathing was steady and calm, and he appeared content. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how long that feeling would last. How long would it be before he realized the complexities of what we were doing? How long before he began to pull away? Just the thought made a wave of fear run through me. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't planned on feeling anything deeper than a fleeting attraction. But now, lying next to him, I knew it was much more than that. I had become attached to him, far more than I had ever meant to. I slowly sat up, trying not to disturb him, wrapping the blanket around myself. I gazed out the window, watching the final rays of the afternoon sun fade behind the trees, leaving the room bathed in a gentle golden light. This couldn't last, I knew that. The rational side of me understood that this was temporary, that whatever we had shared was short-lived. But another part of me, one I hadn't acknowledged until now, wanted it to last, wanted Jacob to stay, and that terrified me. The following days were filled with a confusing blend of longing and uncertainty. Jacob and I kept seeing each other, but something had shifted. He was still kind, still thoughtful, but now there was an invisible barrier between us, an unspoken tension neither of us could ignore. I could tell it wasn't intentional. He was trying to hold on to what we had, but I could see the conflict in his eyes every time we were together. He was young, with his whole life ahead of him, and I couldn't help but wonder if he had begun to regret the path we had chosen. The age difference, which once felt like an exciting secret, now loomed over us like a dark cloud. I noticed the way people looked at us when we were out. Curious stares, judgmental glances. It didn't matter that I felt younger when I was with Jacob, that he made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. To everyone else, we were something that didn't belong, something wrong. Slowly, I began to feel the weight of their judgment. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, Jacob reached for my hand. His touch was warm and comforting, but there was something in his eyes that made my heart sink. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice unsure, as if he wasn't sure how to begin. "About us." A lump formed in my throat, but I nodded, encouraging him to continue. "This is complicated, Margaret," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I don't regret anything, but I'm not sure how to make this work." I knew what he meant. I had dreaded this conversation, but I also knew it was inevitable. We had crossed a line, and now we were both trying to figure out where we stood. "You don't have to explain," I said, keeping my voice calm even though my heart was racing. "I know this is difficult." Jacob looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't expected. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but I can't keep pretending that this is normal." His words hit me like a blow to the stomach, but I forced myself to stay composed. I had known this was coming, that our relationship had been built on shaky ground and couldn't last forever. But knowing it didn't make it easier. After that conversation, things between us began to unravel. We still saw each other, but the closeness we had once shared was gone, replaced by an awkwardness neither of us could shake. I could feel Jacob pulling away, little by little, even though he was trying not to. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. Terrified of losing him, terrified of going back to the life I had before, to the quiet loneliness of my house and the empty days that stretched out before me. It all felt unbearable now, after everything I had felt with Jacob. One evening, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my phone, willing it to ring. Jacob had promised to come by that afternoon, but hours had passed and I hadn't heard from him. A knot of anxiety tightened in my chest. He was pulling away, and I didn't know how to stop it. Finally, after what seemed like forever, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jacob. "I'm sorry, I can't make it tonight. I need some time to think." I stared at the message, my heart sinking. I had known this was coming, but seeing it written out made it feel even more real. I didn't reply. I didn't know how to. Instead, I sat there in the dark, the quiet of the house pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't shake off. The excitement that had once filled me was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness I hadn't expected. I had thought this would be a brief fling, something that would make me feel alive for a while before we both moved on. But it was more than that now. I had allowed myself to care for him, and now I was paying the price. A week went by, and Jacob didn't reach out. I tried to keep busy, filling my days with meaningless tasks, but the emptiness followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ending, that whatever we had shared was slipping away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Then, one evening, Just as the sun was setting, my phone rang. It was Jacob. "Can I come over?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Of course," I replied, though I already knew what was coming. When he arrived, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. We sat in the living room, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I waited for him to speak, but he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "Margaret," he began, his voice soft, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I care about you," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine, "more than I ever thought I would. But I can't keep doing this. I can't pretend that the age difference doesn't matter. I can't pretend that this isn't complicated." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced them back, determined to stay composed. I had known this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "I understand," I whispered. Jacob's face was filled with regret as he looked at me. "I don't want to hurt you, Margaret, but I think it's best if we end this now, before things grew even more complicated." I nodded, unable to find the words to reply. I had always known this couldn't last, but understanding that didn't make the pain any less real. Jacob took my hand, squeezing it gently, as though trying to comfort me during a moment that offered little solace. His touch was warm, familiar, yet felt distant, like a reminder of something that was slipping away. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice heavy with emotion. "I never meant for it to go this far, but I just don't know how to make this work." I looked at him, my heart quietly breaking. He was right. We had crossed a line that had felt thrilling at the time, but now the reality of it all was setting in. The age gap, the secrecy, the uncertainty about where this could lead. It was too much for both of us to handle. "I don't regret anything," I said softly, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I don't want you to think that." Jacob's expression softened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of doubt, like he was rethinking his decision, but just as quickly it was gone. "I don't either," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I can't keep pretending that this is something it's not." I nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say. We had shared something real, something beautiful, but it wasn't meant to last. And accepting that was the hardest part. Understanding that some things, no matter how intense they feel in the moment, aren't meant to be forever. For a few moments, we sat in silence, his hand still holding mine. It felt as though we were both trying to cling to the last bit of what we had, even though we knew it was already slipping away. Eventually, Jacob stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was giving himself time to process what was happening. He glanced around the room as if memorizing it, and then turned back to me. "Take care of yourself, Margaret," he said quietly. "You too, Jacob," I replied, my voice calm, though filled with the weight of all we weren't saying. He lingered for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. I watched him leave, my heart aching in a way I hadn't expected. The door shut softly behind him, and just like that, he was gone. The house felt overwhelmingly silent after he left, the quiet pressing in on me like a heavy fog. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The thrill, the connection, the passion. It had all been real, but now it was over. I slowly stood up, my body heavy with exhaustion, and made my way to the bedroom. The bed felt too big, too empty without him beside me. As I lay there in the dark, I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake. Had I fallen too deeply? Had I let myself feel too much? But even as sadness washed over me, I knew that I wouldn't change a thing. What I had shared with Jacob had awakened something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. It reminded me that I was still capable of desire, of passion, of truly living. And for that, I would always be grateful. The days that followed seemed to drag on, each one slipping by slowly. My life returned to its quiet routines, the same familiar patterns, the same empty spaces. But something had shifted. Even though Jacob was gone, the spark he had reignited in me still flickered, refusing to completely die out. I found myself thinking about him often, wondering what he was doing, how he was feeling. I knew ending things had been the right decision for both of us, but that didn't make the longing go away. It lingered quietly in the background, a soft ache that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to distract myself with small tasks, cleaning the house, organizing my bookshelves, taking long walks around the neighborhood. But no matter what I did, the memories of Jacob kept creeping into my thoughts, teasing me with the possibilities of what might have been. One afternoon, as I was going through some old photo albums, I came across a picture of myself from years ago, a young, vibrant version of me, full of life. I stared at it for a long time, trying to reconcile the woman in the photo with the person I had become. I had spent so many years trying to conform to the expectations of others. A good wife, a good mother, a responsible adult. But in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. Jacob had reminded me of that part, the part that longed for adventure, connection, and something more than just going through the motions. Even though our relationship had ended, I couldn't help but feel thankful for the time we had shared. He had given me something I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of feeling. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the ache of missing Jacob began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. There were still moments when I thought of him, when I felt that familiar longing. But those moments became less frequent, and the emptiness in my heart gradually filled with something else. Acceptance. I knew now that our relationship had been a brief escape from the monotony of my life, an intense but temporary connection that had brought me back to myself. And while it hadn't lasted, It had served its purpose. I had changed. I could feel it in the way I carried myself, in how I approached each day. The quiet loneliness that had once filled my home no longer felt suffocating. I had found a way to reclaim my space, to make it my own again. I started reconnecting with old friends, reaching out to people I hadn't spoken to in years. I joined a local book club, something I'd always wanted to do, but had never found the time for. I began painting, filling my afternoons with color and creativity, which brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. Through it all, I kept the memory of Jacob tucked away in a quiet corner of my heart. I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't push it away either. It had become a part of my story now, a chapter that had helped shape the person I was becoming. One evening, months after Jacob had left, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in hand, watching the sun set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, the air cool and crisp, with the promise of autumn. As I sat there, I realized something I hadn't noticed before. I was content, not just with the quiet, solitary life I had rebuilt, but with the knowledge that I had truly lived, that I had allowed myself to feel something real, even if it hadn't lasted. Jacob had come into my life unexpectedly and left just as unexpectedly, but the impact he had on me remained. He had reminded me that life doesn't have to follow a set path, that sometimes the best experiences come from the most unanticipated places. I took a sip of my wine, smiling to myself as I thought about the future. It was uncertain, of course. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I had rediscovered a part of myself I had thought was lost forever, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood up and made my way inside. The house felt warm, welcoming, no longer the cold, empty space it had once been. It was mine now, a reflection of who I was and who I was becoming. And as I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of hope. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it. I had already faced the hardest part, letting go,